Hello, one and all, and welcome to another edition of Westfield Promise. Today, we're going to be looking at the second article by Mielants, The Political Economies of China and Europe Compared. In the first article that you read back in week 1 and 2, Mielants was focusing on discussing the rise of merchant capital in Europe and kind of examining the origins of capitalism in specifically in northern Italy and how it began to expand out from northern Italy into the river valleys of both Germany, France, and other regions of Europe, such as England um, and the Netherlands. In this article, he's asking a very interesting question, and I'd like to jump over to the article now, and we can see what he is beginning to talk about. All right. Um, so the question that he asks is right here in the very first sentence. What about China? China has long been regarded as one of the most ancient and glorious civilizations. In the Middle Ages, China was probably the most developed of all regions. And this is a point that he is going to hammer home throughout this article. So pay attention to that. There are two particular modes of development that China is processing along in a much more rapid way than Europe. The first of those is it's developing its physical technologies of transportation, particularly by ship. Its physical technologies of production at the level of the farm. Its physical technologies of storage and its physical technologies in the realms of art and artisanry and construction. China's physical technological development is far and away beyond that of Europe. And you can look at any aspect of that, from the kinds of implements that Chinese farmers are using in the field to the kinds of vases and ceramics that the wealthy are possessing and displaying in their homes. All of these are far and away beyond what the Europeans can even hope to come to during the medieval and even the medieval into the early modern period. The second mode of development is their technologies of information. Uh, the Chinese are far more bureaucratically advanced. They have record keeping in their governmental structure. Their state institutions of bureaucracy and record keeping are far and away more advanced than anything that's going on in Europe. Their assessment of taxes, their counting of human beings, their counting and assessment of property, productive property, and how much is being produced on that property, their assessment of military capability, their assessment of trade, and how much value is both being produced and moved around, far beyond anything that could even be hoped of in the most advanced parts of Europe. Um, the difference between in magnitude between somebody who knows basic arithmetic and somebody who knows advanced calculus. Um, the Chinese are also developing information technologies related to currency. They are producing paper currency. That is a technology that requires an incredible amount of effort and understanding of how economics works, an incredible amount of record keeping regarding how much money is being produced and put into the marketplace, and the effect that paper currency is having on the marketplace, when to withhold money from the marketplace because the market is accelerating too quickly, when to introduce more currency into the marketplace when the economy is getting a little bit more sluggish. This kind of expertise does not exist in any regard in Europe. In fact, the understanding of a paper currency would be difficult for Europeans to come to grips with all the way up until, honestly, the 19th century. You start to see the introduction of some paper currency a little bit in the 18th century in England, but it doesn't really become a reality of any importance until the 19th century. And in a lot of ways, the Americans don't even bother with a national paper currency until nearly the 20th century. So when we're looking at the Chinese using paper currency and using it quite effectively, over their long history, going all the way back to the early Middle Ages. It's impressive, to say the least. So the question is, if you have this country that is more wealthy, more advanced, further along in every measurable aspect than Europe, why doesn't capitalism emerge in this space? Why isn't China the one to see the growth of this political economic technology of capitalism and capital production? And he is going to go forth and explain his thesis for why this is the case. I would say one of the things that's very important is comparing the arguments that are made by Wallerstein with the arguments that are being made here by Mielants. Pay attention to the places where Mielants and Wallerstein agree and disagree regarding the emergence of capitalism, because Wallerstein's argument, in short, is that capitalism emerges because there is no empire in Europe, right? Capitalism emerges because of the chaos of medieval Europe politically, and the decentralization of political power among local aristocrats, allowing the space for this bourgeois class of capitalists to come about, to gather resources, and there's no political authority that can kind of stand in the way of that consolidation and amalgamation of capital within this new merchant class. China has this empire, and therefore even though there are individual capitalists within China who treat revenue the way capitalists treat revenue, as a source of new investment, they're never able to gather the kind of critical mass of capital to begin to challenge the state authority. And so the accumulation of wealth within China becomes a conduit for membership within the existing power structure, rather than a kind of self-conscious, self-identified class of people who are going to create and shape the emerging modern state to their will and to their own benefit and to their own interests. So let's take a look. So he begins to make the point that I just made in these first couple of pages: socioeconomic, military, technological developments. Anyone around in 1000 AD comparing medieval China with its European counterpart would have staked his or her bet on China as the one to develop capitalism. Unless you are a world systems theorist or a Marxist, you would say, yeah, well, yeah, because they're more advanced, they're further ahead, right? They're by far more wealthy than Europe. They're far more unified than Europe. And he starts to go into the socioeconomic revolution during the Sung dynasty from the 10th century through the 13th century. He focuses, particularly similar to the first chapter, he focuses on trade, right? And he focuses on the trade in the Indian Ocean, the movement of product from China to the Near East, right? And up until the 9th century, most of Chinese trade had gone across the steppe via Islamic traders. They had become this kind of middlemen to take Chinese goods from what's now Kazakhstan and Afghanistan in caravans across to the Iranian plateau, across Mesopotamia, to the ports of the Levant, which is what we call Palestine and Lebanon, and trade them with the European merchants that were there to purchase them and transport them to Europe. Beginning in this period of the High Middle Ages, you see the Chinese starting to ship more and more of those goods over the ocean. And this mirrors, in a really interesting way, something that we're going to be discussing in the second unit, which is the voyage of Christopher Columbus and the expansion of Europeans along those ocean routes. China is circumnavigating these Islamic traders because these Islamic merchants are taking a chunk out of their profit margins. If I produce jade figurines and I wish to sell them to the Near Eastern Mediterranean markets, it costs me far less to transport them via the Indian Ocean, where I can get the sale price that's found in a city like Acre, rather than selling it to an Islamic merchant and having them carry it overland. The profit margins are better if you transport by sea. The same thing is true of Europeans who go eastward, or sorry, who go westward. Well, I guess the Portuguese go eastward. The Spanish who go westward, the Portuguese who sailed down around Africa going eastward. Both the Spanish and the Portuguese are attempting to do exactly the same thing. They're attempting to circumnavigate the Arab traders so they can purchase directly from the source, right? So he talks about the continued improvement in maritime technology during the Song dynasty. Because of this profit motive, you begin to see the development of new kinds of trading ships. Chinese junks, which are these trading vessels, begin to get larger, more stable, more weatherly. They can handle long periods of time in open ocean. They can handle the rough weather of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea much more capably. They are better in every capacity and keep getting better over time. If I can make a better, more weatherly ship, I can more readily sell that ship to merchants who are interested in holding on to their goods. So he says, under the Song on page 50, the Chinese's principal wealth was a result of commerce and craftsmanship, whereas in the early Song period, revenues were mostly derived from taxation of agriculture. What you are beginning to see evolve is a more complicated economy, where agriculture is still absolutely important. Agriculture is still the fundamental basis of any political economy, because if people can't eat, they don't live. However, more important revenue streams are coming from merchant capital, are coming from mercantile activities, and that merchant capital is coming home and being subsumed into the larger political economy, right? So he says, related to this upsurge on page 51, related to this upsurge in international trade was a growing threat from nomads, right? So as those Muslim and Mongol peoples are iced out of the Chinese trade, they no longer have any interest in maintaining peace on the Chinese hinterland. They become more interested in raiding. If I'm making a ton of money doing trade on the Silk Road from China to the Levant, I also have an interest in maintaining peace along that road. If I no longer have any interest in peace because there's no trade coming that direction, well, why not just start raiding these wealthy Chinese cities in the interior? So the growth of Chinese trade with the West coincides with the kind of impoverishment of the hinterlands around China. And he talks about the 13th and 14th centuries being this kind of high point for Chinese naval power and mercantile power over the sea. Right. Excuse me. He talks about the movement of people, right? He talks about the movement of people from northern to southern China, right? That the effect of you have this transition of population from places where China is relatively poor, right? The northern climates where you have kind of semi-frequent famines, bad weather hits a wheat crop, and all of a sudden everybody's out of food, to the more kind of an increasingly economically stable and wealthy southern China, which is the source of those commercial trading ports like Shanghai, right? He goes into the merchant profits and how important they are to the Song dynasty. But he says, and this is an important point that he makes on page 53, unlike what was happening in Western Europe, Sung government controlled the profitable industries through imposition of state monopolies on the most lucrative commodities, salt, liquor, tea, and incense. So the Chinese government did not allow private enterprise to touch these trades except in areas where it could not itself supervise transport and distribution, right? So this is one of the kind of reasons that he's laying out for why not China. The Chinese notice that trade is resulting in the accumulation of enormous amounts of capital. The Chinese state steps in and says, okay, we are going to assume control of that capital at its source, which is these merchant hubs. If you want to trade in these lucrative products, you have to join the Chinese state monopoly. You effectively become a member of the Chinese government at that point. So you're able to make your profits, but those profits, those economic activities are controlled as an arm of the state rather than by these kind of independent operators that are emerging in the chaos of the politically fractured Europe. So you begin to see this balance of long distance trade being unquestionably in China's favor. Balance of trade being in China's favor means that you're seeing wealth flow from the customers of China's products to China, right? That there is wealth, that the wealth is flowing towards China as they are exporting their luxury goods. They're getting very, very good prices for those luxury goods. And so over time, China's wealth is increasing as a result of this trade, while their customers' wealth is, decreasing in order to get a hold of Chinese luxuries. Right. So you have this rise also that's reflected in the economy. This rise of trade is reflected in the political economy of China as merchants are becoming more and more important and their social status is increasing. This is also reflected in later on in Europe as Europe becomes more mercantile. Merchants in the Middle Ages were seen as little better than peasants. They were seen as kind of below contempt by aristocrats, kind of a necessary evil by people in the upper echelons of society, grubby little lick pennies who would sell their grandmother for a bag of pepper, untrustworthy, unworthy of any serious notice, and largely just people you kind of had to put up with because sometimes you wanted to buy a luxury item from the East to show off how wealthy and awesome you were. But you didn't really talk about them. You didn't do business with them. You certainly didn't think of them as anything approaching a social equal. That begins to change as European merchants become more wealthy and more powerful. They begin to insist upon respect from the aristocracy. And so by the 15th century in Europe, you have powerful merchant families like the de Medicis and like the Fuggers actually marrying their children into the upper nobility of Europe. In one case, the de Medicis actually married a daughter of their house to the King of France. So as your power grows, the level of respect amongst other powerful classes also increases because it's simply unavoidable. People cannot ignore you when you develop that kind of wealth. And likewise, in Sung Dynasty China, merchants who would be considered little better than peasants, as they grow in wealth, they have to be kind of respected. They kind of force the rest of society to treat them as more high status. So again, he says, and this comes in the form of merchants being allowed to purchase rank among the imperial nobility, right? Something that would have been unheard of in earlier dynasties, or even in the early Sung dynasty itself. He begins to talk about China and the Mongols. The arrival of the Mongols is a powerful shock to the system, not just in China, but across the entirety of Asia. The Mongols captured China in the 1270s. They establish a empire that reaches from Shanghai in the south to the Vietnamese border in the south, all the way across to Poland. And because of that gigantic Mongol empire, you begin to see an increase in overland trade that had fallen off during the Song dynasty. The Mongols are very interested in keeping the peace. The Pax Mongolia is a real thing, and it increases the overland connections between the Muslim states in the West, along the Mediterranean and the Mesopotamia, and the Chinese markets in East Asia. He says, the Mongols are, in his mind, one of the explainers of why China never developed capitalism. And he says on page 56, while the Mongol conquest of Sun China cannot be the sole reason for the area's failure to transition to capitalism, it should be considered an important variable. This is a place where Mielants and Wallerstein totally disagree. Mielants says capitalism should have emerged as a product of this commercial development. Wallerstein would shoot back with, absolutely not, because the merchant capitalists were not thinking themselves as an independent class with its own interests and its own self-conscious identity. These merchant capitalists were seeing themselves as a stepping stone to imperial membership. They were transitioning into they saw their status as merchant capitalists as a transition to the proper form of respectful power, which was becoming part of the imperial nobility or the imperial bureaucracy, depending on how wealthy they were able to become. But you have tons of merchants who are paying for tutors to send their children to the to take the tests for the imperial bureaucracy because they wanted their children to be part of that system. They didn't want them to take over the family business. They didn't want them to, because it was a transitionary stage, right? And he says, and Mielants' point, the conquest of the Mongols is what, that's what prevented capitalism from emerging. Mielants would have said, no, what prevented capitalism from emerging was the existence of a coherent Song empire. Because you can't have the development of capitalism when you have a coherent political unity. The coherent economic unity of China and the coherent political unity of China forestalled the development of capitalism because those merchants saw the development of their wealth as a stepping stone to real respectability, which was ennoblement. The reason Europe, in Wallerstein's opinion, saw the emergence of capitalism is because there was no stepping stone to that level of power within Europe. Capitalists could become more powerful than any single king in Europe if they developed enough wealth. The Fuggers, this family of German merchants operating in southern Germany, they became more powerful as capitalists than any prince or king within the continent of Europe. So without that political unification to become a stepping stone for wealthy capitalists to emerge and move into, you don't have the kind of rollover of membership within the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie becomes the capitalist class, in other words, becomes self-aware of themselves as their own class, and then they begin to recognize that their shared common interests, and you begin to that is really the transition to the modern era as they begin to take control of states and transform those states into instruments to pursue their own interests as a class, self-consciously, right? So in England, this looks very much like the kind of slow, gradual humbling of monarchical power and the transition of that power to the parliament, particularly the House of Commons, which represents mercantile interests and mercantile capitalists. And so those steps into creating capitalism are possible, according to Wallerstein, are possible because of the political disunity of Europe. Mielants disagrees. He says, no, this Song dynasty could have done this, except there was this huge disaster that set them back. And then the Ming Dynasty, as we will go on to talk about, that emerges to take over, structures China in such a way to kind of permanently forestall the development of that powerful merchant class, particularly their closure of China off from the rest of the world. He says Western merchants benefited tremendously, both directly and indirectly, from the Pax Mongolia, right? Qui avait créé les circonstances politiques favorables à l'expansion économique des Occidentaux, right? The consolidation, in other words, of politically favorable economic expansion in the West is largely the result of the Mongols' creation of this peaceful Asia-wide empire, right? So he talks about the Mongols, and he says, along with lowering the commercial protection and transaction costs on which city-states depended for their survival, and increasingly amounts of knowledge, such as the navigation techniques and gunpowder, were transmitted from East Asia to Europe. Even in terms of geopolitics, Europeans benefited from the from the indirect weakening of their Muslim enemies in Egypt, right? So the Mongols, in his mind, they crack the Islamic monopoly on the Near East by conquering Baghdad, by weakening the Egyptians. You see this kind of breakup of Muslim stranglehold over the trade into the East. Moving along, he continues to talk about the Mongols and how they began to consolidate their power in Asia and construct these fundamental trading networks that is kind of shifting the balance of trade away from solely going in China's favor to being a much more ebb and flow situation. So they overextended, they collapse, and to the Ming Dynasty, which replaces the Mongols, was preoccupied with things that were much different from either the Song Dynasty or the Mongol Yuan Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty is much more insular looking, right? And initially, the Ming Dynasty is interested in kind of the revitalization of trade in the South China and Indian Oceans. And as a part of that project, it launches the maritime voyages of an admiral named Zheng He. And Zheng He was an interesting figure. He was a eunuch, meaning he was castrated and so unable to have children of his own, which meant he can never be a threat to the Chinese court. And as a result, he was able to be given power without threat that he would ever, give it or try to hand it over to his own children. He was basically loyal to the emperor because he had no dynasty or dynastic possibilities of his own. So he leads this gigantic treasure fleet all around the Indian Ocean and does so multiple times until a power struggle within the Ming court between the eunuchs who are interested in trade, which they largely profit from, and the wives of the concubines of the emperor, who are very much more interested in domestic security and who are very much more interested in the kind of preservation of this idea of a kind of culturally and politically unified China. So as a result, these treasure fleets, which were supposed to revitalize trade, stop. Zheng He is prevented from going again. When he protests, he's arrested. He's eventually let go, but he kind of disappears from the historical record at a certain point, and his trade voyages cease. And in fact, all record of those trade voyages were attempted to be destroyed, which is, we didn't even know about these trading voyages until the late 20th century, when records of these were rediscovered by by the Chinese government. The he goes into the conversation as to the difference between what Zhang He is doing and what the Europeans are developing during the same period. He says on page 62, of course, the Europeans had notions of religious superiority vis-a-vis heathens or infidels that they encountered, but in European interstate system, territoriality was primarily framed in the context of economic exploitation. In 1204, for example, Venice used the Crusaders to obtain the Byzantine Empire's wealth when the later profoundly weakened by internal strife. And Hanseatic City League fought wars with the Dutch because they wanted to preserve their trade monopoly in the Baltic. The same was true in the Mediterranean, where city-states fought bloody wars for the monopolization of trade routes, markets, and the maintenance of colonies on islands that were considered strategically and commercially significant. Right? The pursuit of monopoly rent for the merchants was central, if not the raison d'etre, for these new European city-states. So unlike this consolidated empire, which has interests in maintaining both internal security, which is a very complicated thing to try to maintain. They're also interested in maintaining the legitimacy of this new dynasty, which has just emerged. They're also very interested in the developing external trade relationships that they don't see as bringing kind of chaos to this state system. There's none of that in Europe, right? There's none of those higher level concerns. The merchants control the city-states of Milan and Venice and Genoa and Florence, and they are going to go hard in the paint to make as much money as they can. And there's nobody powerful enough to stop them or forestall them, right? So the Ming are really interested in controlling and establishing a political economy that is going to be long-term sustainable. And they see foreign trade as an element of chaos that they cannot truly control. And they look at the history of the Song and the Yuan dynasties as kind of reflective of this potential danger. That there are forces that are at work when you're engaged in these kinds of marketplaces, which are beyond your control, and therefore they are not to be messed around with. And so they cut, excuse me, and so they cut off this dependency on foreign trade, and the Ming become much more internally focused in their bureaucratic efforts. He goes down to talk about the demand for goods, that demand began to rise within China because the Ming dynasty are doing this very smart thing of ensuring that the peasantry are being well taken care of, something the Yuan were very uninterested in, and something that even the later Song dynasties weren't very interested in. And so the Ming come forward as a result of a peasant revolt, and they say, okay, we're going to make sure that the peasants are taken care of. Well, what happens is you begin to have much more wealth being produced within the Ming dynasty because you're not exploiting people to the limits of their capacity. And so people begin to develop and wealth begins to spread more horizontally during the early period of the Ming. And this provides a lot more available resources for the purchase of luxury items. And so China's domestic consumption of luxuries begins to increase substantially. One of the reasons why the Chinese look back on the Ming dynasty as a kind of golden age is because of this kind of redistribution of wealth and reassessment of levels of exploitation that are going on during the Ming dynasty. He talks about the lack of state support for Chinese merchants and uses this as an explainer for why capitalism doesn't emerge. And it is true that the state was very suspicious of the mercantile class under the Ming dynasty. The existence of Ming, the existence of the casual cruelty, casual violence of the Ming towards their merchant class emerges during this period, and you begin to see like this real tension between the state and the mercantile class. So much so that you begin to see an accelerating level of piracy in the South China Sea as wealthy and powerful naval merchants or wealthy and powerful maritime merchants begin to transition over to becoming just out and out pirates. Like they were trading with product. They were trading with customers in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean. The Chinese government steps in, accuses them of some kind of malfeasance, wants to take their ships and their gold and their product, and these merchants say, "Okay, well, we're outlaws now," and they become what the Japanese called, or what the Chinese called rather, wako, which are these kind of Chinese pirates. So although he says on page 66, although the Ming government began to legalize some overseas civilian undertakings in 1567, which is fairly late after they took power and only after they realized that they had to, this 1567 legalization also coincides with the arrival of the Spanish into China and the bringing of massive amounts of silver from the mines of Potosi in Latin America that resulted from Spanish colonization of the Andes. And the Spanish, newly enriched by their colonies in the New World, are looking to purchase Chinese luxury items for sale in the European market. So the Chinese only really open their doors when they're forced to, right? But even then, the laws on maritime trade appear to have been strictly enforced throughout the coastal areas, and nevertheless, given China's immense coastline, because of an all-controlling, smoothly operating despotic government, simply did not exist. The ban on seaborne trade could not be completely enforced, and illegal maritime smuggling was continued on a large scale. So again, you have legitimate merchants being forced to become pirates and smugglers in order to ply their trade. This is one of the reasons why Mielants points to the development of capitalism being impossible in China, because you can't develop capitalism if all of this economic activity that the Chinese view to be suspicious, namely commerce, is being so strictly regulated and is off the books. It's more difficult to accumulate wealth. It's more difficult to hold on to wealth. I mean, like, if you do develop wealth, what do you do with it? How do you basically make your money illegally and then, buy land and transition into a more legal mode of life? It's not really possible. He talks about the economic policies, and he says these economic policies were not simply a matter of Oriental despotism. Scholars have repeatedly turned to the importance of the multiplicity of partly autonomous and competitive local economic power networks. So essentially, you have local merchants very interested in kind of toning down the degree of power that the kind of more international merchant classes have, but at the same time also trying to become them at the same time. So the uniquely effective administration of China allowed them to be able to put this pressure on these merchants. However, in the doing, stress the state apparatuses to their breaking point. Right? He says in his conclusion, European city-states and emerging nation states fully backed their traders with as much power as possible, right? His argument is the Chinese government didn't, and that the Chinese government trying to hold its merchants back is one of the results of those merchants either agreeing to be a part of these state monopolies or becoming illegal smugglers and pirates. And he says, whereas in Europe, you have these city-state governments that are fully supporting this mercantile activity. I would say that this goes back to our question that Wallerstein poses about, or the opinion that Wallerstein proposes about the existence of an empire. The reason why the city-states of Northern Europe are supporting their merchants so heavily is because the merchants control the city-state governments. They have taken them over by the 15th century. They control these city-states by the end of the 15th century. That is not true in China. And so the government is not run by merchants, for the enrichment of merchants. It is run for He It is run. Sorry, it is run by the imperial court and its nobility in partnership with the imperial bureaucracy, and it exists to sustain their power. If merchants look like they're going to be a threat to that power, they're going to stomp them and push them into either into doing something that is considered to be acceptable levels of trade, or it's going to push them into piracy. It is in my opinion, Wallerstein is correct that it is the existence of the state in and of itself, the power of that imperial state to determine whether or not you're going to allow the emergence of this new class of people who have their own interests that are divergent from and often contradictory to the government, the imperial court. Right. And then he goes on to make the rest of his case regarding Europe. So while this is an incredibly useful article, and I absolutely love this article, I want you to focus on comparing it I want you to look at and compare it to what you read week 3, which is the Wallerstein medieval prelude. One of the things I would like to see you guys doing this week is taking the conclusions that are made by Wallerstein and putting them in comparison to the conclusions that are being made by Wallerstein in this piece, and see where we come up with for there. And I would like you guys to ask questions about this chapter if you have any, and I think you should. And maybe let's get them into a shared Google Doc that I can take a look at, and then I can do a second video answering those questions. But this was me kind of taking you through the kind of broad brushstrokes of Mielants, chapter 2, and we will come back. Hang on one sec. And we will come back next time to talk about your questions on this chapter, and then get into our final week of this unit, where we're going to be talking about the comparison between Europe and the situation in the South China Sea. Be well. I hope you all had a wonderful weekend. I look forward to talking to you very soon. All the best. Bye-bye.